Hello, today we're going to get the first content of the new unit. So this is the third unit of the course, it's a short little unit in what's known as applied ethics, right? Applied ethics is where we take all of the tools we've been developing so far through the course and start to apply them to specific issues, right? This is oftentimes a part of ethics where lots of people like to start, but of course it doesn't really make sense to start here so much as it makes sense to finish here, after you've got all the tools you need to really dive in deep and put these tools to use. So this particular lecture is kind of a little mini lecture. Ordinarily, I would have folded this information into some of the other class periods, but there's no reason that we have to do that in this case. And so I'd like to keep this information separate, record this here, and then take a look in separate lectures at some of the specific authors in applied ethics that we're taking a look at for this term. So one of the first things I want to bring up is that when doing applied ethics, it's important to consider that there are several different levels of disagreement about morality that a person could have, right? When a couple of people or more have some disagreement about the right thing to do or the right way to be, there could be there's lots of different levels at which that disagreement could take place. And it's really important as a good communicator, as a good thinker about ethics, to be able to not only recognize that, but communicate just exactly where the disagreement on some particular issue is. That goes a long way toward at least being able to express a coherent perspective or a point of view about these sorts of things. It may not ever make everybody agree with everybody, but at least understanding where the disagreement is can be a very, very important step in moving forward and making compromises and doing various other kinds of things. Right? So those levels of disagreement are these, and I'll just spell them out, and we've got some examples of these later. The first kind of disagreement is at the level of fundamental value. Okay. The second type of disagreement is a disagreement at the level of moral theory, or and this will include competing moral theories or competing versions of moral theories. And another way you could put this is the criterion for morality, right? People agree that morality is important. They just disagree about what actually counts as morality or what counts as moral, what makes something count as the right or wrong thing to do. And then finally, there can be disagreements about non-moral facts. And these are cases where people agree about the approach to take. They just disagree about how that approach applies in a particular case. And so those disagreements tend to be about what are called non-moral facts. All right, so let's take a look at some examples of these things, starting with the top. So a disagreement about fundamental values, I will say, is I think by a long way the most rare of those three. I think the other two are much more common, much more the thing you're going to see on an everyday basis, but occasionally these do occur. So on the one hand, sometimes, and I would say rarely, the disagreement is about whether morality is in itself important at all. Okay, and so, I mean, certainly part of ethics, usually reserved for meta-ethics, is this question, why be moral, right? And I think that's a question that few really ask, right? I guess one kind of an argument I can sort of think of is something that Nietzsche was famous for. Now, whether Nietzsche actually said anything like this or meant anything like this, you'll have to ask a Nietzsche scholar. That's not me. If Nietzsche didn't actually say this, then just imagine someone named Schmietje said it, and we'll just say again, the important part of this lecture is not to tell you things that are true about Nietzsche, but to give you a good example of what a disagreement about value might be like. So again, this is an argument that, for better or worse, is often attributed to somebody to Nietzsche, and the argument is this, right? That conventional morality, that is the kind of morality that people most of the time walk around with, be kind to your neighbor, be nice to people, turn the other cheek, etc. If you think perhaps conventional Christian morality, if you want to put it that way, those sorts of things. Nietzsche had this view that was, what he called a kind of a herd morality, right? It was for sheep. It wasn't, befitting, a strong, self-actualized, powerful person or something like that, right? And so, for Nietzsche, he had this idea that, conventional morality was, sort of not valuable, actually, contrary to the opinions of, really most of society. Now, On the one hand, that seems like, a sort of viewpoint you might have seen before. It might seem somewhat familiar. But on the other hand, I think there's some dispute as to whether or not that really works as somebody who really thinks that morality is unimportant. Certainly, one might think that the common variety of morality that people around you subscribe to is simply wrong, but it doesn't follow from that morality itself isn't what's important. So I think someone like Kant would say, right, to this, to this figure, whoever's making this kind of argument would say, look, if you're saying that the way that most people think about morality is bad and it should be better, then what you're doing is you're giving an alternate moral theory, not so much saying that morality isn't important. So again, I think it's very, very rare for anybody to honestly think that morality isn't important at all. I mean, perhaps somebody might be some kind of a nihilist, right? Like in The Big Lebowski, there's supposedly these nihilists. Of course, at one point, one of them complains about something being unfair, to which Walter just goes nuts. What kind of nihilist are you, right? So again, people might say that they're nihilists, but I think real, true nihilists are pretty rare. Somebody who really just doesn't think anything is important, or certainly just doesn't think morality is important at all. I think it's a very alien point of view. I mean, it theoretically exists, but again, I think this is very rare. Something that seems much more common is a kind of disagreement where somebody might say deal with conflicts of value. So one that we've actually seen in this course is a conflict between, say, morality and justice. J.J.C. Smart talks about this. Russ Schaefer-Landau talks about this. It's often couched as a kind of an objection to utilitarianism, because utilitarian moral theory can, by following it, sometimes not only lead to but command really serious injustices. And so you might object that utilitarianism puts you in the position of having to choose between two very important values such as morality and justice. And the utilitarian may well say, look, what we're saying here is that morality is more important, right? Again, people like J.J.C. Smart will grant that sometimes utilitarianism can be contrary to justice. And I think that's the central conflict in, of course, the short reading, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which you're all familiar with. It's, a question of very, very much a question of morality in terms, if morality is defined in terms of overall consequences and overall benefit, and justice, which isn't determined with what people deserve. And so there's a very clear conflict there, and that's a very fundamental conflict, right? When people have conflicts of this kind, these are sticky ones, right? But I think these are a lot less common than the other kinds. So let's spend a little more time taking a look at these other kinds of conflicts of morality. So, for example, let's talk about an example of conflicts between moral theories. And so I want to take you all the way back to Peter Singer's argument that was famously made in an article called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. You'll know it as the argument from the Singer Solution to World Poverty, as in your textbook from way back in the utilitarianism argument. And here I'll put the argument up here so that you can sort of pause it, go over it and say, oh yeah, it's that one. Okay, that's the argument we're talking about. And again, remember, Singer's a utilitarian. This is a very utilitarian kind of argument, right? It says that, look, if we're dealing with a total amount of goods, it seems like you could give up some of your goods that you don't really need in order to give a lot more pleasure to somebody who has stuff that they lack that they need, right? So you can go without designer jeans in order so that somebody else can have food and medicine, right? And the idea is that the money in the pocket of somebody who doesn't have any does a lot more good in terms of consequences than in the pocket of somebody who has more than they need. So that's his argument, right? For giving till it hurts, right? Literally, give till it hurts. And so again, it's a very, very standard utilitarian argument. One famous reply to that argument that we didn't really cover or read in this particular course, but that it's out there, you can look for it. It's called Famine, Relief, and the Ideal Moral Code by John Arthur. It's a really excellent article. And so he puts it this way, and I'll, forgive me for sort of reading at you a little bit. He says, equality in the sense of giving equal consideration to equally serious needs is part of our moral code. And so we are led quite rightly, I think, to the conclusion that we should prevent harm to others if in doing so we do not sacrifice anything of comparable moral importance. But there is also another side of the coin, one which Singer ignores. This can be expressed rather awkwardly by the notion of entitlements. While your life may be shortened by the loss of a kidney or less enjoyable if lived with only one eye, these costs are probably not comparable to the loss experienced by a person who will die without a kidney or who is totally blind. If anything is clear, however, it is that our code does not require such heroism. You are entitled to keep your second eye and kidney, and the reason for this is often expressed in terms of rights. It's your body, you have a right to it, and that weighs against whatever duty you have to help. So let's take a look at this paragraph as it plays out here, and highlight some things that I think you should, that at this point, right, in the course, you should really be sort of pinging your attention, right, that they should be jumping right out at you and saying, hey, look at me, I'm important, because I indicate what ethical theory somebody's using. Okay, so I'm going to first highlight this bit here, and you're going to have to excuse my sort of mouse highlighting. It's not bad. So this part here, he says, so we're led quite rightly, I think, to the conclusion that we should prevent harm to others if in doing so we do not sacrifice anything of comparable moral importance. Okay, so Arthur here he's going to be granting, okay, that Singer's basic moral idea is a good one, right? That we really should, all in all, prefer better overall consequences, right? But then he says we have this other. He says there is another side to the coin, right? One which Singer ignores. He says this can be expressed rather awkwardly by the notion of entitlements. He calls that here. But then, of course, later he talks about here this notion of rights and duties, right? Notice a consequences-based morality is a morality that doesn't talk primarily of rights and duties. Rights and duties tend to come more from a Kantian moral theory, or at least a non-consequentialist moral theory. And so what's going on here is that John Arthur is trying to make a case for a kind of ideal moral code that involves certainly considering consequences, but not having consequences be everything. Certainly considering rights and duties, but also not having rights and duties be everything. And if you're thinking, who does that sound like? And you're coming up with, well, that sounds a lot like Ross or some other form of moral pluralist. Got it in one. Give yourself sort of one super ethics point, right? Whatever, like keep track of these in a notebook somewhere. Super ethics point, one, right? Okay, good. Okay, that's exactly what you want to see in here. Right? Arthur's argument continues. He says desert, right? He says is a second form of entitlement. Suppose, for example, an industrious farmer manages through hard work to produce a surplus of food for the winter while a lazy neighbor spends his summer fishing. Must our industrious farmer ignore his hard work and give the surplus away because his neighbor or his family will suffer? What again seems clear is that we have more than one factor to weigh. Okay? Not only should we compare the consequences of keeping of his keeping it with his giving it away, we should also weigh the fact that one farmer deserves the food. He earned it through his labor, okay, and hard work. Perhaps his deserving the product of his labor is outweighed, okay, again, we're talking about weighing different sorts of moral duties, by the greater need of his lazy neighbor, or perhaps it isn't. But being outweighed is not the same as weighing nothing. Okay. Now, again, if that doesn't sound like something Ross would say, where Ross says, look, you have all these duties. They really are your duties. You do have the duty to make your neighbor's life better if you can, right? You also have the duty, to keep what you earn. You have this duty of prudence to look after yourself. And again, those things have to weigh against each other. And just because one outweighs the other doesn't mean the other one doesn't count at all. And that's certainly a criticism of a monist moral theory, which says, no, there's only one thing that counts, versus a pluralist who's going to say, no, there's lots of stuff that counts. It's just that sometimes in some situations, some things will have to count more than others. So again, if it's not really clear that he's a pluralist by this point, you have to take away that bonus like super ethics point, right? But again, if it's clear, keep the point. Okay, so this is an example of then a disagreement between somebody coming at morality from a utilitarian perspective, like Singer, and from a pluralist perspective, like John Arthur. And in fact, the coup de grace for this one is that, he says, our commonly shared morality thus requires that we ignore neither consequences nor entitlements, right? Neither the future results of our action, right? Doesn't that sound like it was coming right out of, he says, nor relevant events in the past. That's coming right out of Ross there. It encourages people to help others in need, especially when it's a friend or someone we're close to geographically, and when that cost is not significant, but it also gives weight to rights and desert so that we are not usually obligated to give to strangers, right? So again, this is This is his sort of response to Singer's very famous argument. And the response says, Singer's got the moral theory wrong here. He's got the criterion for morality wrong. He's not considering enough here. Has a monist theory, a utilitarian theory, as opposed to something that's more pluralist that Arthur argues would make more sense. Okay, so that's an example of a conflict between moral theories, where one person will advocate a certain course of action from the basis of one kind of a moral theory, or will use the kind of reasoning that one moral theory would use, and then somebody else might have advocate a different action on the basis of a different moral theory. So that's an example of that kind of a conflict. So now let's talk a little bit about competing versions of theories. Okay, so and again, I'm going to use an example from Peter Singer, because if you're talking about utilitarians who write really outstanding articles in applied ethics, Peter Singer has got to be darn near, if not at the top of your list. Okay, he's written a lot of really outstanding articles in applied ethics, and a wide variety of things, very consistently utilitarian. Okay, and this is from a work called Practical Ethics. And Singer writes this. He says, if a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. Okay, so again here, notice this key word. This, you have to consider the suffering. Pleasure is the only intrinsic good. Pain is the only intrinsic evil. Pleasure is pleasure. Everyone counts as one. Pain is pain. Everyone counts as one. And so this is an example of the impartiality of utilitarianism, right? No matter whose suffering it is, it has to be considered. No matter what is suffering, whether it's a human or non-human, that suffering has to be taken into consideration. He says, no matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that its suffering be counted equally with like suffering. Okay? Again, if that's not textbook utilitarian, then I don't know what is. Insofar as rough comparisons can be made of any other being, if a being is not capable of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there is nothing to be taken into account. Okay? Again, this is classic hedonistic utilitarianism. It's just about pleasures, just about pains. That's it. Okay. This is again. It should, when you see this, it should jump up and down, and say, "Hi, it's hedonistic utilitarianism," right? He says this is why the limit of sentience, okay, using the term as convenient if not strict accurate shorthand for the capacity to suffer or experience enjoyment or happiness. That's exactly what that word means. Very often in science fiction, people will use the word sentience to describe things that are like thinking things, right? It's like, oh, that's a sentient alien as opposed to whatever. And it drives me crazy. It's a misuse of the term. If they want to talk about like thinking beings, they need to use the word sapient, right? Sentient means capable of like feeling things, right? That's what it means. That means it can feel things, right? So sentience really does mean, can feel things like, say, pain, for example. Okay, sapience means can think, right, or reason or something like that. So anyway, sentience, he says this is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. To mark this boundary by some characteristic like intelligence or rationality would be to mark it in an arbitrary way. Why not choose some other characteristic like skin color, he says, right, as a way to say, look, as an example of a completely arbitrary moral characteristic. Okay, so again, this is, if this doesn't say as clearly as anything can, hey, I'm a utilitarian, a hedonistic classical utilitarian, then I don't know what does. And so to oppose that, let's take a look at this argument here from someone named Ruth Sigmund. I really love this article. We're actually going to be talking about some animal rights and arguments, and we're going to be seeing a couple of those. But unfortunately, neither Singer's nor Sigmund's article are printed in the Schaefer-Landau text. I don't think, and so I guess those aren't the ones we're going to be taking a look at. But I really do like this Sigmund article. It's called "Death, Misfortune, and Species Inequality," and if you're interested in this sort of thing, I'd absolutely look it up. So Sigmund says, if one thinks with Bentham, okay, a classic utilitarian, that all the good and bad things that can happen to one in life are quantities of pleasurable and painful experiences, right? Just quantities, right, of pleasure and pain. Then the comparison between animal and human misfortune will appear to be quite reasonable. For it is plausible, given this conception, to suggest that one can distinguish degrees of intensity of animal pain as well as one can do this with human pain. Okay? And notice that's just exactly what Singer appears to have done on the previous slide and argued for it and stated outright. He says, absolutely, you can do this. She says, but notice this view suggests, A, that all misfortune involves unpleasant experiences, right? So the assumption here is that what she's going to end up arguing is that some kinds of things that count as misfortunes don't necessarily involve the physical sensation of pain, right? That it's not an unpleasant experience, even if it can be a misfortune. And B, that all unpleasant experiences are measurable against one another, which is implausible, most implausible where tragedies and many other severe misfortunes are concerned. So, so she's going to be presenting a different kind of a view of this. And so she continues. She says, to be a possible subject of misfortunes which are not merely unpleasant experiences, one must be able to desire and value certain things. The kind of misfortune which is in question here is death, and discover whether this is a misfortune for an animal, we must ask whether or in what sense animals don't want to die. Of course, in some sense, this is true of virtually all animals, which manifest acute fear when their lives are threatened. Yet blindly clinging on to life is not the same thing as wanting to live because one values life. This is the kind of desire for life of which persons are capable. It is this which gives sense to the claim that death is a misfortune, even a tragedy, for a person. Right. And so I'm going to fill in a little bit of history of philosophy here, and this tracks a dispute in utilitarianism that we didn't really cover in this course just because you can't cover everything. This is an introductory ethics course. This is level 1 stuff, right? And you have to draw a line somewhere. But one thing about utilitarianism that, say, for example, John Stuart Mill, who is a kind of protege of Jeremy Bentham's, sort of introduces is that Mill thought that it wasn't just quantities of pleasure that were important, but he thought that there was a difference in qualities of pleasure that could be experienced by different beings. And so let me give you a very quick example. So say, for example, this is actually true. So my cat, whose name is Ludwig, he's a teenager now. He sleeps all the time. He's an old kitty, but he's still a great cat, wonderful cat. But in any case, he looks like he's wearing a tuxedo, including like little white gloves and little white boots or whatever, right? And so every now and then it's sort of, just because that's my personality, I might, I put, like, while folding laundry or something, I might put a couple of socks on my hands, and he's just sort of staring at me, watching me do things, like, and I'll sit there and stare at him, and make remarks about, oh, all dressed up and know where to go, and you're like, yeah, what's the fancy outfit for today, or, got a symphony to conduct there, or, ask him to, show me to my table, and, send, or I snap my fingers at him, say, garçon, right, stuff like that, right, just to, again, make fun of the fact that he looks like he's wearing a tuxedo. This kind of mockery, right, because that's what it is, mockery, is completely harmless to the cat because he does not speak English, right? If anything, he's sort of just happy for the attention. I don't know, right? But he shows no sign at all of perceiving this as mockery, okay? But of course, this would be entirely different with a person, right? To relentlessly mock somebody might be to create quite an unpleasant experience for them, I mean, mockery can be extremely cruel, right? It can be a very bad experience for somebody. Yet it's not physical pain, right? It's the sort of thing that a utilitarian probably ought to consider, right? And so this is an example of if you'll say a sort of a higher quality of pain, right? That it seems like humans are certainly capable of, but that we certainly don't have any evidence that many animals are capable of that. Look, I might be wrong about my cat entirely. I just have no evidence that I'm wrong about that. So you might, again, say things like, and so that's a kind of it. Also, there's a kind of pleasure, for example, in sort of mastering a new language. Okay, right? I mean, it's pleasurable, it's fun, there's sort of a thrill to it. One of my favorite experiences through like my high school years and in early college was reading Roman poetry, because the stuff is fantastic, right? But and you can't translate it, right? So Latin as a language is really ambiguous. Like their vocabulary isn't as large as the vocabulary of English, and their grammar is just lets a word order kind of flow all over the place, and so there's a lot of ambiguity in Latin that most of the time they rely on context to keep that stuff clear. But in poetry, when it's really well crafted, you see all these layers of meaning that could all work, right? And yet, and they're all sort of intended by the author, and you just see this layer upon layer upon layer of ambiguity, and you just can't translate it. And so there's a certain pleasure in sort of knowing something that that not everybody knows, right? Again, that seems like a higher quality of pleasure. my dog, as much as I love her, is not capable of understanding that, right? So that's a pleasure of which she is not capable. Okay, and so this is essentially what Sigmund is bringing up here. She's bringing up a very old disagreement among utilitarians about whether it's just the mere quantity of the feelings of pleasure or pain that are important, or if there are other kinds of pleasant and unpleasant experiences and situations that are also important and have to be considered. Does quality of pleasure really have to enter in, or doesn't it? And when Mill introduces his notion of the qualities of pleasure, he really introduces a whole different version of utilitarianism from that introduced by Bentham with his plain old, quantity-driven hedonistic calculus. Right. So this is a great example of where people are essentially both utilitarians. They're both consequentialists. They both say you want as much of, the good stuff as the good consequences as possible, and as little of the bad consequences. But they very much disagree on which version of utilitarianism is the best one to use here. One of which will give, sort of full and total, right, equality to, to animals, because their suffering, at least in terms of pains, is equal. And then on the other hand, Sigmund will say, well, the kinds of consideration they merit is certainly there, right? There's certainly some, but not total, because of course there are misfortunes that humans are capable of suffering that animals are not capable of suffering. So, I mean, that's a real important disagreement, and the disagreement is at the level that they're actually using different versions of the utilitarian theory. So that happens, and again, you'll have to sort of, that has to sort of pop out if you've learned about those sorts of things. Then finally, the last thing I want to deal with here is, again, a very common kind of a disagreement, the non-moral facts disagreement. So it's this kind of disagreement. The parties are agreed that morality is the issue. They're agreed on which moral theory is correct. For example, let's say that they're both utilitarians, but they disagree about what the consequences of X and Y are, right? They know, okay, we've got to do X or Y. We're making a decision here. And of course, we all agree that you have to do the thing that has the best overall consequences. Imagine they even have the same version of utilitarianism in mind. They just disagree about what the actual consequences to X and Y actually are. One of them says there'll be this, the other says they won't, there'll be that, and that's a disagreement about non-moral facts. It's what would happen if we did this or that. They all agree that you should choose the one that has the best consequences. They just disagree about what the consequences actually are. Right? Another way to have this kind of a disagreement would be to agree, oh, look, no, what we should do is we should do that which does not treat people as a means, and as always as an end only. But you might disagree about what those sorts of things are. And so again, you might have the same moral theory, you might have the same idea of what makes something right or wrong. You just disagree about how a particular case applies to that criteria. Okay, and those are what we call non-moral facts. Those are things like, well, how things turn out, or the meanings of certain terms or concepts or something like that. Those are generally non-moral facts. So this is the very simplest kind of moral disagreement. And again, recognizing what kind of disagreement is going on doesn't always help you resolve it, but it's certainly great progress to be able to note what kind it is, so that you at least have some chance at being able to communicate well with the various parties who do have this kind of a disagreement. Or when somebody disagrees with you, you'll see, oh, I see where you're coming from. You're coming from a reasonable perspective here, and that all by itself is huge progress, right? If you can sort of recognize what kind of reasonable and unreasonable places different people are coming from. Again, that's a first step to being a really first-class thinker in ethics and a communicator in ethics. Right, so from here, we're going to end up going to move on to talk about some specific articles in applied ethics, and we're going to see this kind of an approach, taken with specific issues.